Hello and welcome to the second video of the series Simplified Openings, Practical Solutions to Opening Problems. After the first one, dealing with the Queen's Gambit Accepted, that you can check on my channel, it was published last Saturday, I thought that perhaps it's a good idea to complete the repertoire based on the Queen's Gambit Accepted. So in this video I will be addressing the most popular alternatives to White's second move c4, and these will include the London system, the notorious one, but let me jump ahead a little bit and tell you that I'm quite happy with the idea and the system I discovered against it, the Jobava, and the second move knight f3. So let's get going. d4, d5, and now we will first take a look at the move knight f3. Now the very good thing about the lines that I explained last week in the video on the Queen's Gambit Accepted is that in this position Black can play the move c5, and this severely cuts White's options. Now the point is, first and foremost, that if White wanted to play the London system after knight f3, after c5, this is no longer possible. So in a way, White was move ordered out of the London system if that was his intention. Now second is that in this position White's best move is the move c4, but after d takes c4 we actually have a direct transposition to the lines in the Queen's Gambit Accepted that we looked at last week. So already we have eliminated a huge option for White, which is the second move knight f3, where after c5 White's last move leads us back to our prepared lines in the Queen's Gambit Accepted. Now with this being said, of course White can try different moves, and for example, let's check a few of them. The move g3 is possible, some sort of a reversed Grunfeld. So now c takes d4, and now White should really be careful, because taking on d4 after e5, knight b3, bishop e6 just gives Black a very comfortable reversed Grunfeld, because Black gets really smooth development. Let's say bishop g2, knight f6, castle, bishop e7, c4, knight c6. Really fantastic development, as Black managed to defend the d5 pawn, and now with the knight on c6 the long diagonal is blocked, and already there is a threat of d4. So this is not very good for White. In fact, what White should do is delay the capture with bishop g2, now knight f6. Now knight c6 is also possible, but this allows White to play the reversed Grunfeld style with knight d4, e4, knight takes c6, bc, and c4. A perfectly possible line. It's fine for Black, but well, why to allow it? So knight f6, castles, and now still playing the waiting game, not knight c6 because of the lines that I just showed, but the move h6. This is a little move that is quite useful, because the ideas like bishop g5 are common for White in this system. And the idea is still the same: if knight d4, e5, and there is no knight takes on c6, and there is also no bishop g5 pinning the knight and then increasing the pressure on the d5 pawn. So bishop f4 is White's best move, and now e6. So e5 is no longer possible because the bishop controls it, but e6 is fine, and after knight d4, knight bd7, threatening e5 now. And Black is doing quite alright here. I will just give you just a bit more depth in this line, that the best move for White is now e4, e5, a sharp line, he takes d5, now bishop c5, Black wants to finish development and castle, rook e1, castles, bishop e5, knight e5, rook e5, Black is 2 pawns down, but after queen b6 already you see the idea. The knight on d4 is hanging, the pawn on f2, and also the pawn on b2. And this gives Black good counterplay. c3 is the best move. Now bishop d4, c d4, queen b2, knight d2, queen d4, and Black got the 2 pawns back. So with a unclear but definitely playable position for Black. So that's the move g3. Another option for White is e3, and this will lead to some sort of a Colovic system, knight f6. And now either b3 or c3, or bishop d3. Against b3, the Zuckertort it's very important to remember that when the moment b3 is played, black should take on d4, so as not to allow white to play bishop b2, and then after taking on d4 to keep capturing with a piece, or with a bishop or a knight. Whereas after now cd4, knight d4, e5 is just good for black, as while ed4, knight c6, bishop b2, bishop g4, we see the idea that the bishop on b2 is just very passive, looking at this pawn on d4, and the structure on the queen side, white's queen side, has been weakened. Ideally, he would like to have a pawn on b2 and a pawn on c3, but not vice versa. Another idea is c4. Now you could say, okay, we have been tricked, no queen's gambit accepted, which is true. After dc4, bishop c4, we already have a knight on f6, so it's the main lines of the queen's gambit accepted. But even though it also can be played if black doesn't transpose immediately with e6, but there is an even better option here, which is cd4, ed4, and g6. And now black simply goes bishop g7, short castle, and we'll have a very good play against this IQP on d4 after knight c6 and dc4 at some point and so forth. So this is an imprecise move order for white. And there is also on bishop d3, and now knight c6, short castle, and bishop g4. So we have pin on the knight on f3, e6 comes next, bishop d6 or bishop e7, short castle. Comfortable development for black with no problems whatsoever. And the Cole, c3. There's more than one good way to play against the Cole. I quite like one system. Knight bd7 first, or queen c7 first. Okay, I'll start with knight bd7 just to show some additional options. Knight bd2. And now the line I like is the move queen c7, intending quick e5. It's a rare line, but I've looked at it and it's quite promising for black, because after exchanges on e5, queen comes to e5, there are some lines with bishop d6 hitting h2, or the bishop is developed in long castle, g5, g4. Some interesting ideas for black. But there are other ways. For example, there is e6, bishop d3, b6, short castle, bishop b7, controlling the e4 square, and then developing bishop e7 or bishop d6, short castle with good play. Or fianchettoing, g6, bishop d3, bishop g7, castles, and black is doing quite all right. Yeah, b6, bishop b7. It's just a very nice position for black already. But like I said, I kind of like this queen c7 idea, plan that can happen immediately. Okay, queen c7, knight bd2, knight bd7, and then e5 next. Quite an interesting idea. And the final move for white is d takes e5. But after e6, this is already good for black, because after e4, bishop c5, ed, bishop b5 check, knight c6, short castle. Black is in fact a tempo up compared to the Tarrasch variation of the French defense. For example, now knight g7 is a direct transposition to that position with a tempo up for black, whereas thanks to that extra tempo, black can also play knight f6. So knight g7, knight bd2, short castle, and let's say knight b3, and now either bishop b6 or d6, both are possible, and thanks to this extra tempo, black is doing quite all right. Yeah, bishop's coming to g4, rook e8, or knight g6, knight f5, okay, depending on circumstances. So to show you how that extra tempo works out, I will just start from the beginning and just show e4, e6, d4, d5, knight d2, c5, ed, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and now black plays bishop d6. Yeah, dc5, bishop c5. So loses this tempo, bishop d6, bishop c5. Yeah, first to d6 and then to c5. Whereas in the variation we saw, the bishop takes on c5 in one move, because white takes on c5 on move 3. So that's already pretty good. So that's pretty much everything against knight f3. Okay, knight f3, c5, and those are white's options. You could see quite limited, yeah, unless white transposes to the queen's gambit accepted after c4, dc4, which, like I said, is already something that we have prepared, bearing in mind the lines from last week. Now let's take a look at the Jobava. Knight c3, knight f6, bishop f4. Again, many lines here, but I liked the lines that I proposed in my chessable course on the Chevanenko Slav lifetime repertoire. c6. I think it's a very simple line to play without much knowledge of theory. And what I like about it is that it gives black a choice whether he wants to play in a sharper way or to keep it more controlled. So to give you an idea what I mean, let's say queen d2, bishop f5 and f3. So the idea of f3 is to prepare either e4 or g4. And usually in these moments when white plays f3, this is the moment when black has a choice. If black wants to play sharp, okay, e6 is possible, g4, bishop g6, h4, now h5, g5 and knight fd7. So black closed the king side with h5, bishop g6, and then we'll start playing on the queen side, b5, b4, c5, depending on circumstances and so forth. So this is one idea, to play sharply, because white will castle long and there will be black can get an attack going. But there is also a more positional way, and that is the move h5, stopping g4. So depending on taste, depending on mood, preferences, black can treat the position in more than one way. So e3, e6, this is more balanced. Now castles b5 is very good for black because there is no attack for white on the king side, whereas black is already attacking with b4, maybe knight is coming to c4, maybe queen a5, maybe bishop b4. Things are coming. So bishop d3, bishop takes d3, and now either way white recaptures, black is doing great. So let's say queen d3, queen b6, avoiding c5, queen b5 check, yeah? So attacking b2, castle, c5, dc5, bishop c5, and it's already great for black. Knight is coming to c6 or to d7, and very good position. Similar is cd, c5, knight b5, knight s6, dc5, bishop c5, and again it's no problems for black whatsoever. So you could see these are the two options, yeah, either playing sharp or playing more positionally by playing h5, and this applies to the other move e3, bishop f5, f3, yeah, and now again either positional ways, h5, bishop d3, let's say queen d3, e6, and again queen b6 can come, c5, and so forth, or sharper lines, e6, g4, bishop g6, h4, h5, g5, knight fd7, bishop d3, and now it's important, take on d3, play g6 and cement the king side, bishop g7 is coming, short castle, and then black can attack b5, c5, knight b6, knight c4, b4, queen a5, okay, depending on circumstances, with good counterplay on the queen side, whereas white can hardly make something on the other wing. So there's the Jobava. See, pretty simple, straightforward line, c6, bishop f5, with the option to either play solid or to play more sharply. And now we move on to the London system, the notorious London system. I love the city, one of my favorite cities, but when it comes to the opening, well, I mean, I've always been happy to meet it, let's put it like that. So bishop f4. In one of my previous videos, I gave you also another way to deal with the London system, but that was after the move knight f6. So d4, knight f6, bishop f4, which was based on the reversed Reti setup with b6, bishop b7, then d6 and c5. You can look up that video on my channel. Whereas here we will take a look at what happens when black has already committed the pawn on d5. So we start with c5. Now the point in this variation that I'm going to show is that it's very important for black to keep the knight on g8. And we will see why this is important, because the move order chosen later allows black to develop the knight to e7. So this is an important detail. That is why we don't go knight f6, but we go c5. Now white usually goes e3. There is a sharper line like e4, but it's pretty harmless. D takes e4, d5, knight f6, attacking the pawn on d5, now knight c3, and now simply g6, and bishop g7, short castle. So black is a pawn up, and well, white kind of finds it difficult to create any counterplay here. For example, queen d2, bishop g7, bishop h6, castles, takes, castles long, and queen d6, and ideas like rook d8, e6, queen e5, just coming, and black has very good game in addition to being a pawn up. So that's why white usually plays e3, knight c6, and now white can start with c3 or knight f3. And another great thing about this system is that for black it doesn't really matter how white starts. There are move order subtleties, whether knight d2 first, whether c3 first, whether knight f3 first, but for black it just doesn't matter whatsoever. So this is a great aspect because just simply decreases the chances of going wrong. There is one additional option that black has if white starts with knight f3. Yeah? So now the transposition to the lines we will be looking at is with the move e6 and then followed by bishop d6. But with the knight on f3, if black wishes so, there is an additional option, and it is to take on d4, cd4, e4, and play bishop g4. So to pin the knight because it came to f3 a bit too early, and after c3 to go e6, and then play the same, bishop d6 and knight e7. So this is also a pretty good version. It has been played by Wesley So, Hikaru Nakamura, strong players, and he scored pretty well. So that's an extra option that black has after knight f3. So in order to avoid that, let's start with c3 and now e6. Again, many good lines against the London, but this one is really straightforward and universal. Yeah, it does not depend on move orders. So e6, now knight f3. Again, it doesn't really matter if white starts with knight d2 or knight f3 or whatsoever. We will be getting the same position without fail. So let's say knight d2, bishop d6, bishop g3, knight g7, knight f3, and we are getting the same position. So knight f3, bishop d6, now bishop g3, because taking on d6 is just too easy. Queen d6, knight d2, knight f6, bishop d3, and then either e5 immediately, yeah, or castles e5 again. Black has no worries whatsoever. So that's why bishop g3, and now knight g7. So this is the black's idea. This was the point of keeping the knight on g8. And of course, it's not my idea. I just discovered it in the games of Matthias Bluebaum, very strong German Grandmaster. And there are quite a lot of games by him in these lines. And if you really want to study this with a bit more depth, I suggest you take a look at his games in this system. So now white goes bishop d3 or knight d2, doesn't matter because both moves will be played. So bishop d3, castles, knight bd2, and now comes the moment when black takes on d4, cd4. Now usually London system players would take with the e-pawn, transposing to this reversed Carlsbad structure. Taking with the other pawn cd4 is a bit too symmetrical, I would say, for London players, but it's possible. After all, it has been played by Magnus Carlsen against Bluebaum, but black is doing quite all right here after knight f5. And the knight is basically coming to d6, the ideal square for the knight in these symmetrical, let's say, exchange Slav structures. The tactical justification of knight f5 is that capturing that knight after ef5 allows black to go f4 very quickly. So let's say bishop d6, queen d6, and f4 is coming next, getting rid of the double pawns and opening the diagonal for the bishop. White's problem is that g3 doesn't really work, as f4 is even stronger now. So the bishop is coming either to h3 to stop castling or to g4 to pin the knight, and let's say gf4, knight b4 already is very troublesome for white. Rook e8, queen f4 will be threatened then because of the pin-ins already. Now bishop f5, targeting c2 and d3. Already it's very difficult for white, so this doesn't really work. So Carlsen played bishop takes d6, and now Bluebaum took with the queen, which was also very smooth and easy equality, but simply I think knight d6 is even easier. Castles bishop d7, and White's problem is that this knight on d2 is a very silly piece, and it controls the c4 square, but it's a clumsy piece, very defensive, as if it moves from d2, black can actually occupy the c4 square, and then things like queen b6, knight a5, knight c4 can happen, and so forth. So it's an equal position, but no problems for black here. So ED4 is normally played, and now the key move F6. And this is why I like this line a lot, because it's very straightforward, this reversed Carlsbad structure where black employs Botvinnik's plan in the proper Carlsbad of advancing in the center with D5. And it's amazing how quickly white can actually be worse in this position. There are quite a few games with Bluebaum playing black when his opponents couldn't deal appropriately, and like next few moves they were already much worse. So for example, take a look at this Queen B1, just an example here from against Mateusz Bartel, against very strong Grandmaster. H6, castles, bishop takes G3, H3, and E5. Already black has a fantastic position. So E4 is threatened, and if bishop C2, E4, knight H2, F5, already black has a extremely strong attack. It's 14 moves, and black has a big advantage. So you see quickly, white can end up in trouble. Similar is, for example, taking on D6, Queen D6, castles E5. And again, no problems whatsoever, E4 is threatened. There is an interesting move, better moves are moves like castles and C4. C4 is interesting, but it's a pawn sacrifice, okay? D takes E4, knight takes bishop C4, bishop G3, H3, knight D4. Knight D4, Queen D4. White has certain compensation, but nothing more than just equality. In fact, Bluebaum won 2 games from this position playing with the black pieces where white couldn't really find the compensation. So best case scenario for white is that he somehow equalizes. And the best move is castle. And now bishop takes G3, H takes G3 and E5. Again, threatening E4. And now the only move more or less for white to kind of keep the balance is the move C4. Because taking D, E5, F, E5 again threatens E4, bishop C2, E4 already, black has an advantage again. Let's say knight D4, knight D4, CD4, and now knight C6, for example. Queen D6 there is also another move, Queen B6. Again, it's even visually clear that black is doing fantastically here. So the move that white should play not to end up already somewhat worse is the move C4, and you have to admit that it's not an easy move to make without preparation, because black was threatening E4 and white is basically allowing it. And again, this already puts pressure, psychological pressure on white in the opening. So anyway, it's not a very probable move, especially by an unprepared player, but we should check the best moves anyway. Now the point of C4 is that E4 is not very good because of C takes D5. And now the pawn is hanging on E4, and after ED3, DC6, knight C6 check on B3, and white wins the pawn. Now there's one game, Lei against Bluebaum, where Bluebaum went knight B4, which is the second best move in the position, attacking the bishop, and after bishop B1, now E4. So the knight is no longer on C6, so CD5 doesn't attack it. And after E4, he attacks the knight, but Queen B3 is a very strong move for white, attacking the knight. Now E takes F3, Queen takes B4, and now an improvement over the game where black took on G2 is first to go A5 to harass the queen, Queen C5, B6, Queen A3, and now take on G2, and after Rook E1, Rook F7, very sharp position, pretty unclear. And the best move in the position, and the simpler one, is to go bishop F5, developing and attacking the bishop on D3. And after bishop F5, knight F5, there is a lot of tension and pressure in the center, but things do simplify after D takes E5, F takes E5, let's say CD5, Queen D5, let's say Rook Fe1, knight D4, and this is an equal position. Black doesn't really have problems. He has an isolated pawn on E5, but that pawn ensures a fantastic outpost for a knight on D4, and that knight is definitely a compensation for the pawn on E5. So an equal position, but still a playable one for both sides here. So with this, we conclude the analysis of our Repertoire based on the Queen's Gambit accepted. We covered the most common sidelines, let's say, except for C4, which most likely you are about to meet, the Jobava system, the London system, and the second move knight F3. And again, I hope I provided these really straightforward, simple lines that do not require a lot of memorization, that are easy to learn, easy to understand, and also easy to play. So, thanks for watching this video. Now I'll do my Nakamura thing. Make sure you smash that subscribe button. Leave your comments in the comment section. Tell me what you think. And there's one more thing I wanted to say, is that I progressed when doing these series in videos. At some point I plan to introduce a video where I would be analyzing games submitted by you, the viewers. So after a while, if you have played some games in the lines that are proposed in one of these videos, and hopefully they will be good ones, I will just be happy to analyze them in a video. So practice the repertoires, practice the openings, and thanks for watching again. See you in the next one. Take care, everybody.